Gyro aim still hasn't become a standard feature yet, but it has turned a major corner this past year. After being ignored for most of the PS4's life, support was suddenly added for The Last of Us Part 2, then Fortnite and a handful of others. The industry is slowly getting there, but for now PC remains the best way to get gyro aim in multi-platform titles. But PC has a big problem. You have to set it up yourself, and it's not at all simple to do that. Gyro works best when set as a mouse, but very few games allow mouse input while a gamepad is active. If you want to try gyro aim but don't know where to begin, or if you're already using it and want more ideas, or if you like cats, this video is for you. I'll walk through the main ways to set gyro up through Steam as well as JoyShockMapper, which has more advanced features for people already familiar with gyro. I'll also compare the advantages and disadvantages of the main controller options. But first, motion control is a gimmick. It's for casuals who want to wave their hands around and dance. Real gamers use sticks and sit motionless in the same place until they die. Just use a mouse. With that out of the way, we'll start with Steam. In case you're completely new to this, the first step is to enter your controller settings in big picture mode and enable configuration support for the type of gamepad you've chosen. From there, you can connect it with either USB or Bluetooth and Steam should recognize it automatically. Big picture mode is set to get an update soon, so it may look very different to those of you watching in the future, but I expect the core settings won't change. Ideally, you should set your controller configuration while the game is running to make sure that Steam is hooked in properly. This is mostly important for emulators, but it's better to be safe. The first and in my experience best approach is the hybrid method. This lets you keep analog input and face button glyphs during normal gameplay, but when aiming, the controller temporarily shifts to keyboard and mouse so that you can make the fullest use of the gyro. The catch to this method is that your game has to have an aim button to trigger the swap. If there isn't any type of down sights or over-the-shoulder function, or if you want gyro on all the time, you'll have to use another method. I'm using a DualSense here, but the setup is the same for all controller types. The first thing to do is to create a new action set, not a layer. This will house all of the keyboard and mouse inputs when aiming, so name it Aiming, and choose not to copy anything over. You can now click the button that says Aiming to switch to the new set. Click the gyro icon and set the mode to mouse. Then set the enable button to left trigger full pull. Next, set the triggers to be the mouse clicks. For most games, aiming is done on the left trigger and on PC the right mouse button, so we'll place the right mouse button here. We'll then set the right trigger to the left mouse button, which is almost always fire. If your game has different controls, like right trigger to aim with the face button to fire, you'll have to set the mouse clicks on those inputs instead. Click the analog stick and change its input type to directional pad, then fill it with WASD. This will limit you to digital movement when aiming, but I find the downgrade is hard to notice. Click on the right stick and set the mapping to joystick mouse. This will allow the right stick to continue aiming as it normally does, so you can use it in conjunction with the gyro. Now is the complicated part. We need to tell Steam when we want the controller to shift to this set of controls, and Valve didn't make that very intuitive to set up. Use the button at the top to go back to the default action set. You should see regular gamepad controls again. Click the left trigger and change the full pull action. From this menu, find the box with the 3 circles and arrows in it and click it. This is the activator used for changing sets. Click OK and now choose the aiming set we created from the drop-down menu. Disable the notification checkboxes, as these would get really annoying fast. Before leaving, click the full pull box one more time and find the Show Activators button at the bottom. Change the activator type to Start Press. We've now told Steam to change to our aiming set when the left trigger is pressed. Now we need to tell it when to change back to the default controls or the switch will be permanent. Go back to the aiming action set and click the left trigger again. This time we're going to put the activator on the soft pull action so that we can keep the right mouse button on full pull. Click the activator box and find the default set in the drop-down menu, and don't forget to disable the notifications again. Once again, click the soft pull action we just set up and click Show Activators. Change the activation type to Release Press. This means that the controller will revert to its default set whenever Steam detects that the trigger is released. At this point, test your aiming out in the game and make sure that you can walk, aim, and fire. You should not be able to reload or perform any other actions when aiming because we haven't set them up yet. If you can do those things, the gamepad controls are still active. You may have chosen an action layer instead of set. If aiming works, we can set up the rest of the controls, which will vary by game. Most games will display the keyboard bindings in the pause menu. We only need to worry about the ones needed while aiming, like reloading or dodging. We also need to know which buttons do these actions on a gamepad if you aren't already familiar. This is also usually found in the options menu. Reload is almost always the R key, and in RE2 that action is on the square button, so in my aiming set I'll place the R key there. We also need the right bumper to change ammo types, which is bound to the E key. The last thing this game needs is the D-pad for swapping weapons. 1 through 4 are used for that, and it can be hard to know which goes where, so I'm just going to wing it and test. I got it wrong, but I can see the correct layout when aiming, so a quick fix and everything is all set. At this point, the game is done. RE2 has simple controls, so there isn't much to set up, but other games may need more actions to be added to their aiming sets. If you have multiple games with similar controls like this, you can avoid doing all of this work again by exporting your preset as a personal binding. Give it a clear name that you'll recognize, and then when setting up the next game you can import this scheme to load the basics up immediately. All that's needed from there is to adjust the stuff specific to the new game, which is usually just face button mappings. You can also share configs between controller types, but first you'll have to enable that option. If you plan to use one config across a lot of games, you can also save it as a template. This will make it easier to find in the menu without having to scroll through your entire game list. If your action set doesn't work for whatever reason, you can achieve the same results by using mode shifting. This is a somewhat obsolete way of doing things because it makes it hard to see your aiming layout. Every keyboard input will be nested within the controller inputs on the menu, but it does have the advantage of not needing to set up complicated activators. To use this method, don't create any action set. Change the left trigger mapping to the right mouse button. Then set the gyro to be a mouse that activates on left trigger pull. From there, go to every required input on the gamepad and add a mode shift action, with the shift button set to left trigger full pull. Fill these mode shifts with the needed keyboard and mouse bindings, just as with the action set, the critical ones again being right analog as joystick mouse, and right trigger as left mouse click. When you pull the left trigger, the results should basically be the same as the action set method, but depending on the game it could function slightly better or worse. This hybrid method works well 95% of the time, but it has occasional hiccups. In RE4, this QuickTime event uses the left trigger, but because that button was replaced by the activator, pulling it will just shift into keyboard mode, where the QTE becomes left mouse click, which is mapped to the right trigger, but only when I hold the left trigger to get into the aiming set first. It's confusing. RE5 and 6 will display messages when changing controller types. 5 has a mod to disable the message, but for a lot of games you might be stuck with headaches like this. Sometimes Steam also just completely craps the bed. This is the price that has to be paid for so few games allowing mouse and gamepad simultaneously. Valve did try to address this limitation by adding another gyro mode, called mouse joystick. This one is far simpler to set up and exclusively uses gamepad input, so there's no swapping to keyboard controls for any action. That means that you can enable the gyro at all times if you want, and that your glyphs for QuickTime events will never change. The big problem with this method is that your gyro will be output as and mixed with the right stick, which means it will be subject to dead zones and any curves the game applies to that stick. And because gyro aim is all about small movements, a dead zone can completely kill its appeal. You'll also be limited to the fastest speed the game allows the analogs to have, which in some cases is far too slow to be usable. If your game doesn't allow high stick sensitivity, mouse joystick is already a non-starter. Begin with a normal gamepad template, then set the gyro to mouse joystick. If you only want the gyro active when aiming, you can set the enable button to left trigger pull. That's basically all it takes to get started, but in most games it will feel awful to use without further tweaking. Test whether the gyro responds to very small movements. If not, you may need to increase the minimum output setting. This is found in the gyro's additional settings menu. Boost the X and Y sliders little by little until your smallest movements register in the game. You don't want these any higher than necessary because they exaggerate the speed of small movements, which can make it harder to aim slowly. You can polish the response to be more or less sensitive by using the Enhanced Small Movement Precision option. The custom response curve can also be useful to counter inconsistent acceleration in the aiming speed. The adjustments needed will vary so much game by game that there's not much clear advice to give here. Just fiddle with everything and check if it feels better or worse. This method never feels as good as using the gyro as a mouse, but it can work well enough to get by, and it can match the quality of some official gyro schemes found on consoles. Many developers still don't understand that gyro is best when dropped in as raw mouse input on top of regular controls. Nothing fancier than that. So you may see dead zones and acceleration curves even in games with native support. Mouse joystick at least gets you to that tier of gyro control. Steam's final option can be the most awkward to set up, but it can also provide the most flexibility. Full keyboard and mouse lets you do whatever you want with the gyro while retaining mouse output, so you can do always-on gyro without compromising on aim quality. The main problem with this one is that analog input and face button glyphs are completely sacrificed, which may matter a lot in certain games. It can also be hard to condense a keyboard layout into a gamepad's button scheme. While gamepad buttons are very context dependent and do multiple jobs, keyboard schemes tend to be spread out to take advantage of many keys. Because of this, you may still need to use mode shifting to fit everything onto the controller. There are also conflicts between the input types that can't be easily resolved, like the fact that the WASD keys can be pressed simultaneously on a keyboard, but not when mapped onto a joystick. If a game uses WASD for prompts, you may have to make space for duplicate mappings of those keys elsewhere. Begin by hitting the Browse Configs button, then visit the template list. Choose Keyboard and Mouse and hit Apply. The good news is that most basic actions are already set up. From here, you'll need to make use of the binding list your game provides to identify every key needed. Grabbing a picture of this with your phone helps. Put all of the keyboard bindings in the respective places seen on the gamepad layout, if the game has one. RE4 uses the south button to both run and reload when aiming, and mode shifting can be used to recreate that behavior. Shift is the run key on PC, so I'll bind that to B and then add a mode shift when the left trigger is pulled. I'll make a button pad and place the R key there. Now B can do both actions. Work your way through all the actions one by one until you have everything mapped. You may need to take liberties and deviate from the official gamepad layout to make everything fit. On-screen prompts will be confusing if you use the default key bindings, so consider changing them in the game menu to match the letter of the face button they're going to. For instance, instead of E, I can change this binding to Y. That way at least some of the prompts will display as ABXY. This obviously doesn't work as well for PlayStation controllers, but it's still better than a bunch of random keyboard keys. For games like Metal Gear, where stealth is critical, you can simulate analog movement by using ring bindings. This option lets you change what the stick outputs when tilting beyond a certain point. After mapping the stick to WASD, enter the Additional Settings menu and set the outer ring binding to left control key. This is the walk key, and it will now be mixed in to make Snake move slower when the stick is fully pressed. That's obviously backwards, so invert ring binding also needs to be enabled to make the speed ramp up properly. Old Kiefer will now move slowly at first and then run when the stick is fully pressed. For games where slow movement is the default and running requires a key, you can just place run on the outer ring without inverting it. If you're not happy with the amount of tilt needed for the transition, you can adjust the outer ring radius to make the shift happen with more or less pressure. This method sacrifices the analog input advantages controllers have, but it's the best route when the game doesn't allow hybrid configs or when you want the gyro always on. It's also kind of a relief to stick with one input type and not have prompts changing all the time. It's never my first choice, but going all keyboard can work really well. If all of this has sounded too simple for you, then strap in for the next option, JoyShockMapper. This program was developed by JibSmart to introduce flickstick controls to PC. The idea of flickstick is that because gyro has aiming covered now, the right stick is freed up to handle turning in a new and more efficient way. So instead of rotating the camera, right stick now faces your character in a given direction. You can visualize it as being similar to a top-down game, where pressing the stick snaps your character in that direction. That's what your right analog does in flickstick, leaving all of the emphasis on gyro to do the aiming. It's a little disorienting at first, but it does let you react to attacks coming from off-screen much faster, making it ideal for multiplayer shooters. JoyShockMapper can also be used to do regular gyro aim, but it has no GUI and every binding has to be entered as text, making it far less user-friendly than Steam. Because of that, I'd recommend sticking to Steam unless you specifically want flickstick. Begin by downloading JoyShockMapper, then check its wiki to see if your game has a config. If it does, copy the body of text and create a new text document to paste it in, naming it after the game. The config will probably have instructions to follow, the most important being to match the in-game sensitivity to the config sensitivity. If this isn't done, the stick won't quite flick in the right directions. Connect your controller and open JoyShockMapper. Once the startup seems to finish, test your controller inputs to make sure there's a response. When you're ready, drag your TXT config into the window and hit enter. Your controller will now output the bindings from the config. If your cursor is drifting, enter the command Restart Gyro Calibration. Once you see the cursor stabilize, enter Finish Gyro Calibration, and then start your game. If all is well, pressing the right stick in the cardinal directions will cause you to spin exactly those ways. Jib also recommends doing a full rotation to see if you end up facing exactly where you started. If your game doesn't have a config, you can create one by typing out the mappings one by one, but the easier fallback is to use Steam instead. Valve followed JibSmart's lead and added flickstick as a mode for the right analog. Jib initially had some problems with Steam's implementation, but it seems like most of that has been fixed, and in my experience it works well. After making a keyboard and mouse config, change the right analog to flickstick mode. The only setting you likely need to worry about is mouse sensitivity. Adjust it up or down until your 90 and 180 degree stick presses are snapping in the right directions. Like in Splatoon, you'll be completely reliant on the gyro for looking up and down. To make small camera corrections, you will have to hold the right stick forward, then slightly turn left or right. These are the hardest things to get used to, but the speed advantage when doing 180s and snapping to enemies should be clear right away, and it only took about an hour to click for me. In fact, when going back to regular controls now, I find myself trying to flick out of habit. For single-player games, I still prefer the more relaxed feel of a traditional stick, but flickstick is by far more competitive for online play, and it's great to see that developers are starting to adopt it as an official scheme. Those are the main ways to get gyro on PC. I'm sure that there are other methods, but these have worked the best for me. Of course, you can't begin without a gyro-equipped controller, and I've spent a lot of time with the current options. Too much. Not many reviews focus on gyro performance, so I tried to come up with tests that would specifically isolate the stuff relevant to motion. First, the most important one, just a general shooting test in AimLab. I did this for the Steam controller video, but AimLab has changed since then, so I redid all of the tests and gathered more data this time. 25 results for each pad instead of 10. The results were boring. All pads were within the margin of error, and there was no takeaway about one gyro being better than another. I tried random tests to see if one lost calibration faster, but it was all a wash. The most interesting thing about the results is that when I did my Steam controller review, its scores were consistently lower than the other pads. Here it still had the lowest average score, but only by a hair, and it had the single highest score in the set. Maybe I found better settings or just got better at using it. The one clear difference between the sensors is that, all else being equal, the Switch Pro is much more sensitive. It seems like a scale factor error on the part of Steam and SDL rather than a reflection of the gyro's quality though. It just means that you need to use lower sensitivity settings when using this pad. I've found the sensor actually doesn't matter as much as the rest of the controller. The ergonomics and especially the trigger can make a difference in your aim. I tested stability by pulling the trigger to the beat of a metronome while trying to keep the aim stable. The DualSense was the clear loser here. Its triggers have the most resistance and depth, which means the controller is more likely to shake not only when pulling, but also from the recoil when letting go. It's also extremely fatiguing when doing rapid trigger pulls, and I do think this is why I couldn't score as high with it in AimLab. People make a big deal out of the Switch not having analog triggers, but they make everything other than driving feel worse. On a PS5, the adaptive tension might be cool, but on PC very few games support that, so the triggers are basically a total downgrade from the others. You should consider swapping the trigger and bumper buttons around to make the shooting more stable and comfortable. The Steam controller analogs are much lighter and shallower, so they don't cause as much trouble. The dual stage feature also gives you the option of only doing a soft pull to get a response, and this gave me even less shake. I find it hard to avoid doing full pulls during gameplay though, and it was still hard to keep up with the metronome. The Switch Pro's digital triggers did the best here. They still shake, but it's mild and there's no fatigue when doing very fast pulls. But none of these tests revealed anything major. I was able to do about as well with any given pad as another. Just pick whatever controller you happen to have lying around and you'll be fine. The Steam controller may be hard to find, but the grips and trackpads make it the best choice for absorbing keyboard and mouse configs. That is what Valve designed it for, after all. It works the best for always-on gyro and first-person games, but it's not well suited to flickstick. The DualSense is comfortable to hold and has great features, but half of those aren't available on PC, and it's my least favorite by a small margin. In addition to the trigger issue, it has poor battery life and it's had more problems with Steam than the other pads. I kept experiencing gyro drift when first using it, even if I had just calibrated. Turning auto-calibration off seemed to fix it. The feature breaks with the DualSense in a way I haven't seen before. You can get into the weeds about its high polling rate and low latency, but those things clearly didn't give it any kind of edge in my testing. I bought it thinking it would be an upgrade from the Switch Pro, but I'm still mostly using that controller. There are some downsides here compared to the DualSense. The early model D-pads are terrible and the haptics are weaker, but the gyro performance has always been great through Steam. I would say the ergonomics are at least as good as Sony's and the battery is far better. If you don't have a gyro controller and are specifically buying one to use on PC, this is the one I'd recommend. The new models even seem to have fixed D-pads, so there's no glaring weak point left. Now you know everything you need to know to get started with gyro aiming on PC. A few quick tips before you go out there and start dominating. Make sure to stand when you play. This is necessary for the motion to work. Move your arms around in large, embarrassing gestures, as this provides the sensor with the range of data it needs. It also helps if you map most of your actions to controller shakes, and you should try to fiercely vibrate the controller while swinging it around the room. Follow these tips and you'll be at the top of the scoreboards in no time. Thanks for watching and good luck.
Come on now! Hey, get out of that cabinet, boy! Go on! Get on the ball! Yeah! How'd you get so cute? Yeah! Don't go getting too curious now! You making biscuits out there? Woo! Go ahead and give me a little bath! Woo! Go on!